So I've been seeing this really strange phenomenon on Chinese social media recently. It's not about celebrity gossip. It's not about the latest economic policy or anything like that. It's about history.
Oh, interesting.
Specifically, it's about the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty, Chongzhen. At first, it just looked like harmless nostalgia. You had people online expressing this deep, almost personal grief for an emperor who died over 300 years ago.
Right.
They were praising the Ming as this open, civilized era that was completely destroyed when the king took over in 1644. And this mourning for Ming literature quickly went from a niche internet meme to a pretty significant trend.
But I'm guessing it didn't stop there.
Not at all. It got absurd. I saw one post with tens of thousands of likes that was no longer just historical lamenting. It was a full-blown conspiracy theory.
Okay, now I'm hooked. What was the theory?
The person claimed that the Qing government didn't just let China fall behind. They claimed the king intentionally gave away world-leading lithography machine technology, which was supposedly documented in the Yongle-Dadian to the west.
Lithography machine technology.
In the 17th century.
Exactly. And the conclusion was that China's current bottleneck in the chip industry isn't rooted in modern tech competition, but in a 380-year-old Manchu betrayal. And this idea, it obviously doesn't hold up to any real scrutiny, but it spread like wildfire. It became a way to blame all the current dissatisfaction with the economy and international standing on the historical legacy of non-Han rulers.
Wow.
And then, the turning point. The government stopped being silent. Official media suddenly published an article coining a term I had never heard before. 1644 historiography.
A new official term? That's always significant. It is. And they didn't just label it a historical error. They put it in the same category as things they've been cracking down on for a while, like extreme feminism, and accused it of providing justification for those who deny the legitimacy of China's unified multi-ethnic state.
So this is where it gets really serious.
It does. How does an internet discussion about a Ming emperor make the modern government so nervous? When people start calling to oppose Qing, restore Ming, what are they really opposing? What are they trying to restore? And why is the state so urgently defending a dynasty that's been gone for nearly 400 years?
It is a stunning collision, isn't it? On the surface, you have people mourning an emperor who died centuries ago, but right beneath that nostalgia, you find the real pain points of the 21st century. This isn't just about, dusty archives or some academic debate over who is a better ruler.
No, it's not. And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling, the sheer complexity of the forces at play. You've got modern geopolitical anxieties. The fear of being held hostage by bottleneck technologies like the chips we need for 5G and AI. And that's clashing head-on with this deep-seated cultural romanticism about an idealized past.
And that entire mix is running straight into the core identity and, crucially, the territorial claims of the modern Chinese state.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of history being weaponized to process current dissatisfaction.
And the stakes are clearly much higher than they appear because the state has identified this 1644 historiography as a legitimate, even existential threat to its unifying ideology.
Okay, so our mission today is to really unpack that collision using the sources you brought to the table. We need to move past the viral memes, past the ridiculous lithography machine conspiracy. We're going to analyze this whole thing from three angles. The economic anxiety that's fueling the blame game.
The cultural critique that's wrapped up in this idealization of the Ming.
And finally, the immediate political security threat that the state perceives in all of this.
It's the only way to truly understand why 1644 is such a flashpoint today. Let's start where that audience anxiety begins, with the chip war and this search for a historical scapegoat.
Okay, let's unpack this modern anxiety first, because it really does provide the immediate context for this whole 1644 historiography idea.
Right.
We see this clear coping mechanism in the conspiracy theories. The narrative is basically China was technologically world-leading until the non-Han King rulers took over and deliberately severed that lineage, leading directly to today's struggles.
It's a classic, but deeply flawed search for a single, easily identifiable historical failure to blame for incredibly complex. So when he looks back at the historical record, maybe he's looking at texts like the Tiangong Kaiwu, the exploitation of the works of nature, with all its detailed sketches of 17th century engineering. He feels this intense sense of historical injustice.
He sees these intricate sketches of metallurgy and looms and says, wait a minute, We had it. We were on the cusp of an industrial revolution, and it was stolen from us.
Precisely. This narrative conveniently reframes the Qing takeover in 1644 as the single moment that China's industrial evolution ground to a halt. It's an easy out, you know? You can blame a single historical event and an ethnically distinct ruling class for a complex economic problem that actually took centuries to unfold.
It's a search for a golden age.
It is. They claim this golden age was prosperous, technologically dominant, and had these amazing achievements, like the voyages of Zheng He, which were then mysteriously curtailed by the next dynasty.
But, okay, we have to move from the conspiracy theory to the actual historical economics, which is far more nuanced. When scholars study China's technological past and its economic divergence from the West, what does the serious scholarship actually say?
The serious debate, the one that's dominated economic history for decades, is what's known as the Great Divergence, that massive economic separation between China and the West that happened mostly during the 18th and 19th centuries.
And the sources are really clear that this divergence wasn't just one single event. It was actually two distinct, separate phenomena.
Correct. And understanding these two phases is vital. The first phase was England industrializing first in the 18th and early 19th centuries. This process, inventing the steam engine, the power loom, it meant that England and then Europe pulled dramatically ahead, leaving China and basically every other economy on the planet behind by the mid-19th century.
So that's the first gap, the invention gap.
Yes. But the second phase, which often gets confused with the first, is the diffusion gap. This is the period from the mid-19th to the early 20th century, where China then industrialized significantly slower than other latecomers like Japan.
I see.
And this second phase is crucial because it speaks directly to China's internal capacity to adopt and scale technologies that were already known.
So the problem shifts. By, say, 1900, the technology was available to China. It was being imported, but the country struggled to actually implement it effectively at scale. So when economic historians look at this vertically, comparing China's own performance over time, what was the root systemic constraint that lasted from the 18th century all the way up to the mid-20th?
According to scholars like Taisu Zhang, that core constraint was a severe and persistent capital shortage. This wasn't a lack of smart people or ingenuity. The sources show that west-to-east tech transfer was actually plentiful after 1850.
Right.
The real problem was whether Asian economies, and China specifically, had the immense reservoirs of capital you need to make effective use of those technological imports.
Industrialization, especially that shift from craft production to mechanized factories, it requires massive capital investments. You need money to build a huge factory, buy hundreds of power looms, fuel these giant steam engines.
Exactly. And the Qing economy, by comparison, was severely undercapitalized. This inhibited both domestic innovation because scaling up required capital only available to the wealthiest merchants, and more importantly, later on, it inhibited the effective use of imported technologies. The question completely shifts from, did they have the blueprint for a lithography machine, to, did they have the money to build the factory to use that machine?
Okay, so if a chronic capital shortage was the core problem, why did Qing China fail so profoundly to accumulate that capital? You made the claim earlier that the Qing state was a fiscal, an extreme outlier among major early modern powers. Let's dig into that.
The answer is buried deep within the institutional and cultural commitments of the Qing state itself, which, essentially rendered it fiscally impotent compared to its competitors. The comparison is really stark.
So how weak was its fiscal capacity?
By the 19th century, the Qing government was taxing a mere 1% to 2% of GDP annually. Now think about its predecessors. The earlier Ming Dynasty, often criticized for being corrupt in its late stage, taxed 5% or more. The Song Dynasty, much earlier, taxed closer to 10% of GDP.
And what about internationally?
The difference is even more jarring. Contemporary island nations like England or Japan, precisely the nations that industrialized rapidly, were taxing between 15 and 20% of GDP during that same period. Even the Ottoman Empire, which was under significant strain, managed to tax around 5 to 6%.
Wow.
So the Qing state was, for all intents and purposes, basically broke. It lacked the financial capacity to invest in infrastructure, military modernization, or institutional support for commerce for almost the entire 19th century.
So why? Was this just incompetence, or was there some deep ideological commitment that dictated this fiscal paralysis?
It was an ideological commitment, and one rooted in history and culture specifically, the traumatic memory of 1644 itself. The core reason was the Qing state's rigid institutional commitment to fiscal conservatism. This view held that increasing agricultural taxes was morally wrong and, even more importantly, politically dangerous.
But hold on, scholars often point to other things for the Ming collapse, right? Like massive silver imports destabilizing the economy or huge famines, environmental factors. Isn't blaming it purely on tax hikes a political simplification that the Qing rulers created for their own purposes?
It absolutely was a politically expedient simplification, but it became the dominant reality for the new regime. The psychological trauma of the Ming collapse, which ended with the Tongzhen emperor committing suicide during a massive peasant rebellion, it produced a fundamentally new ideological paradigm for the Qing.
Okay.
Early Qing elites, desperate to learn from the mistakes of the Ming, coalesced around this narrative that the primary culprit was late Ming agricultural tax hikes, regardless of all those other underlying factors.
So they took an old Confucian moral belief about, not competing for profit with the people, and they basically weaponized it. They turned it into the central principle of political survival. If high taxes killed the Ming, then low taxes would save the Qing.
And this fear became the dominant institutional paradigm for over 2 centuries. The state committed politically and institutionally to never pursuing significant agricultural tax hikes. And critically, they actively undermined their own administrative capacity to even consider a tax increase.
Let's talk about that administrative mechanism. The sources mention the ban on land surveying. How did that specifically lock in fiscal weakness?
This is a key technical detail. From the 1740s onward, the Qing state formally outlawed land surveying. Now, land surveys are the basic administrative tool any state needs to know what it's taxing.
Of course.
Without periodic surveys, your tax registers become increasingly inaccurate over time. As land productivity improved, or as new land was brought under cultivation, the tax base remained frozen based on these outdated 17th century records.
So, by preventing themselves from even knowing the true economic reality of the empire, they politically reinforced this empirically dubious belief that any tax hike, no matter how small, would incite a mass peasant rebellion.
Exactly. This administrative blinding, which was perpetuated for 2 centuries, meant the state had voluntarily abandoned the ability to grow its revenues alongside economic expansion. It sealed its own fate as a fiscally weak state, completely unable to meet the demands of modern warfare, institutional development, or the infrastructure required for industrialization.
So state extraction was institutionally shut down. But pre-industrial economies accumulate capital in 3 main ways. If the state couldn't do it through taxes, where else could capital have come from? How did the Qing's system manage to shut down the other 2 mechanisms as well?
It's the unique institutional structure that's the real story here. It effectively shut down private land concentration and the ability to scale up large corporations, the 2 other main avenues for private capital accumulation.
Okay, let's take the first one. Private land concentration. In Western Europe, you had the enclosure movements and changing property laws that allowed large landowners to dispossess smallholders. That led to immense wealth concentration and created a pool of capital that could be invested in early industry.
But in Qing China, the customary property rights regime substantially impeded that kind of bottom-up, organic wealth concentration. This is where culture and institutions really intertwine. Kinship networks, which were the dominant social organizing force under Confucian norms, allocated status based not just on wealth, but on age and generational seniority.
So the wealthiest merchant in the village didn't automatically get to call all the shots.
Not necessarily. This traditional structure gave lower-income households, even peasant tenants, enough political voice within their own communities to shape property institutions in their favor.
So what did that look like in practice?
It resulted in things like strong tenant protections, making eviction really difficult, and strict restrictions on using land as collateral for large commercial loans.
Which means the land remained dispersed among many smallholders.
It did. Landholding remained comparatively dispersed throughout the Qing and even the Republican periods. The system was remarkably successful at protecting the smallholder and preserving a sort of generalized agrarian egalitarianism. It created a society with relatively low wealth inequality compared to contemporary Europe.
And while that sounds normatively desirable, preventing mass suffering, creating social stability, it was absolutely fatal for industrial capital formation.
That is the essential trade-off. Industrialization requires massive economic expropriation, the removal of wealth from the hands of the many and its concentration in the hands of a few, either through rising wealth inequality, the private mechanism, or large-scale government extraction, the state mechanism. The Qing system, rooted in this Confucian-driven social protection, successfully impeded both.
Which leaves the third mechanism.
Yeah.
Large corporations. For industry to truly scale, you need businesses that can operate far beyond the local village or the kinship network.
Exactly. For businesses to grow into industrial giants, they need modern legal technologies that allow them to collaborate with strangers across vast distances while mitigating risk. We are talking about concepts like limited liability and entity shielding.
Explain what entity shielding is and why a state needs to be fiscally strong to support it.
So, entity shielding is the legal principle that separates the assets of the business from the personal assets of its owners. It protects against catastrophic loss and allows the business to survive the death or failure of an individual owner. Limited liability then further shields the investors, ensuring their personal loss is capped at their investment.
This is absolutely fundamental to scaling a modern enterprise.
It is. But these legal protections are only credible and functional if the state can provide high levels of uniform law enforcement across large geographical distances. You need courts, police, and regulatory bodies that can verify contracts, enforce standardized commercial law, and protect property rights against distant, unknown parties.
And the fiscally weak king state just couldn't offer that infrastructure.
It couldn't afford to. The state's severe fiscal weakness meant it lacked the capacity to extend uniform, robust law enforcement everywhere. Therefore, the risk associated with investing in a large corporation run by strangers just remained too high. Businesses stayed small, often limited to close-knit social networks where risk could be managed through personal trust.
Right.
So the lack of business corporations until well into the 20th century was a downstream consequence of the same ideological forces that created the fiscal weakness in the first place.
So the economic problem of the king was actually that it did too good a job protecting the agrarian private economy from exploitation. It locked into place this cultural legal paradigm of low taxation and dispersed wealth, which made industrial capital impossible to form.
That is the ultimate conclusion of this economic history. This unique cultural system created institutions that made capital accumulation extremely difficult across all three dimensions. And that led to a pace of industrialization that was inevitably slow compared to its global competitors. This is the real story behind the technological divergence, a world away from conspiracy theories about lithography machines.
Which brings us to the vertical solution, the final phase of this economic history.
Yeah.
How China finally caught up. If fiscal conservatism and protecting dispersed wealth was the problem, how was it solved?
The solution required a complete reversal of the Qing model. China's successful industrial catch-up happened precisely because it decisively rejected Qing fiscal conservatism and embraced aggressive statism and wealth concentration.
And we saw an acceleration even before the communist era, right? During the Republican period.
Yes. Starting in the early 20th century, especially in coastal cities, foreign capital started pouring in, and the state fiscal capacity began to recover. It ultimately more than tripled by the 1930s, and industrial growth accelerated significantly in the parts of the country where the state could assert stronger fiscal and legal control, even while the rural areas were still dealing with stagnation and chaos.
But the real definitive shift came after 1949.
Absolutely. The communist era marked a near-total reversal. It involved a massive top-down expansion of state capacity, large capital injections, initially from the Soviet Union, and a decisive and often brutal rejection of that agrarian egalitarian Qing paradigm. This led to high levels of capital accumulation through state planning, rapid industrialization, and eventually the successful market reforms after 1978.
So the powerful state apparatus and the high wealth inequality we see today, the very mechanisms that fuel China's stunning economic growth, are a total reversal of the situation back in 1900.
They are. The modern success was achieved by demolishing the very legal and cultural structures of low taxation and dispersed wealth that the Qing had entrenched. The irony is unavoidable. The current obsession with the 1644 technological fallacy as the source of modern chip woes is blaming the Qing for not industrializing, when the actual systemic failure was the entrenched cultural paradigm of fiscal witness rooted in the memory of the Ming collapse.
That economic analysis provides a powerful framework, but we need to pivot now. Because the rise of this mourning Ming literature isn't purely about historical economics. It's heavily fueled by cultural and emotional yearnings.
Yeah.
When we look at Ming Romanticism, we see it operating as a result-oriented critique against contemporary governance and what's seen as the decadence of the West.
That's right. The Ming Dynasty is being held up as a time when China supposedly possessed the ideals and governance efficiency needed for genuine civilizational resilience. The narrative argues that the king, by contrast, ushered in an era of intellectual stagnation, administrative corruption, and military incompetence, which all culminated in the humiliation of the 19th century.
So whether they're just historical enthusiasts or more aggressive Han nationalists, they're looking for an authentic Chinese model, a pre-1644 model that wasn't corrupted by foreign Manchu rule or by extension by contemporary Western decadence. They romanticize the Ming's prosperity, its naval power with Zheng He, its literary achievements.
What's deeply fascinating is how this Ming romanticism draws on sophisticated philosophical shifts that were already happening in the late Ming, specifically this obsession with Zen, or authenticity and reality, and king emotion and passion. This wasn't just some proto-nationalism, it was a profound intellectual movement that touched on something approaching Western notions of individualism and critical thought.
Let's delve into that philosophy of Zen and King. How did this philosophical movement challenge the established Confucian orthodoxy of the time?
It was heavily influenced by the Wang Yang-Ming school of thought, which placed a new emphasis on the individual heart-mind as the center for moral insight. These thinkers argued that the only way to access the underlying Zen, the ultimate reality or moral universe, was through spontaneous, authentic emotional responses, or Qing.
So they were arguing that deep emotional sincerity was a more reliable guide to truth than simply memorizing and rigidly adhering to canonical text.
Precisely. It was a radical rejection of the rigidity that was associated with the restoration of antiquity, that trend of adhering to archaic literary forms. They argued that the validity of Qing of emotion was tested by reference to Zen, to reality, defining authenticity in contrast to the hypocrisy that came from merely conforming to social and literary conventions.
And this philosophical opening suddenly validated things like vernacular literature novels and dramas, because those forms used untrammeled colloquialisms, and they didn't have to conform to canonical modes. It allowed for creative, non-orthodox expression.
Yes. The push for authenticity, with Zen meaning both true feeling and reality, quickly transposed into questions about the accurate communication of the poet's experience and the external world it was meant to embody. This created a profound demand for accuracy in art.
And this is where the critique starts to move away from abstract moralizing and into describing the concrete world.
Exactly. Poets in the Gongan school, for instance, argued that a poem had to be in tune with the reality of one's time. It had to reflect the specific conditions of their existence, not just some ancient idealized morality.
And this leads us to that surprising detail about the poet Jiang Yanqi.
Jiang Yanqi required the accurate description of things and events, even banal everyday objects like bowls or cake, to be included in poetry. Now think about how shocking that must have been to traditional literati at the time.
Shocking indeed. I mean, traditional poetry was about grand themes, abstract moral superiority, and classical illusions. And suddenly you have a philosopher saying, to be authentic, you must include the specific tea bowl or cake that's right in front of you.
It was revolutionary. This attention to particularity validated a reality that was independent of the writer. It challenged the notion that the purpose of all art was simply to illustrate traditional abstract morality. They were arguing that art should reflect what was real about the current world in all its specificity, independent of whether it served an immediate moral lesson.
And that focus on objective reality, on specific events and things, is the key intellectual vibrancy that the romanticizers believe the king just crushed. They see this philosophical liberalization as having been extinguished by cultural repression.
And they cite powerful evidence to support that argument of king cultural suppression. The most cited examples are the numerous cases of literary persecution, the so-called literary inquisitions.
And these weren't just isolated incidents, were they?
No, not at all. Hundreds of intellectuals and their families were executed, and thousands of ancient texts that were deemed subversive were burned. The offenses were often minor. A single line of poetry that could be interpreted as criticizing the ruling Manchu elite, maybe by referring to them as barbarians. The sheer volume of this intellectual terror sent a clear message. Conformity was mandatory.
And the suppression went beyond politically sensitive comments, moving into actual scientific inquiry.
Yes, tragically. Critics cite the case of a scientist who was executed for arguing that the brain, rather than the heart, was the center of thought. That level of thought policing is chilling. It demonstrates how intellectual inquiry that deviated from the accepted canonical paradigm, even what we'd see as scientific fact, could be targeted under the guise of maintaining political and ideological order.
Right.
And the romanticizers interpret this as the Manchus deliberately extinguishing the vibrant, critical, and scientifically curious intellectual liberalization of the late Ming.
This cultural anxiety about lost authenticity then feeds directly into modern social movements, most visibly the Hanfu movement.
The Hanfu movement is a very direct, tangible manifestation of this cultural romanticism and the underlying Han nationalist sentiment. Enthusiasts seek to wear traditional Han garments as a more authentic representation of Chinese culture and history, rejecting clothing that's associated with the conquest era.
They specifically reject things like the qipao or the teng suan.
Right. They view those styles as products of violent, forced assimilation during the 17th century conquest, as historical products of Manchu influence, and therefore as cultural king relics. And this criticism extends to modern media, fueling attacks on actors associated with Manchu roles or braid dramas, accusing them of perpetuating the cultural legacy of a regime that was seen as both brutal internally and incompetent internationally.
So the Ming isn't just a dynasty anymore. It's a proxy for an idealized, uncorrupted, and intellectually vigorous Pax Seneca that they believe can rejuvenate modern China and provide an alternative to the perceived decadence of contemporary global culture.
That's it. It's a powerful cultural tool to express current dissatisfaction without directly attacking the present government. Instead, it attacks the historical foundation of the current unified state.
And that brings us right to the moment the state breaks its silence and elevates this entire debate into a national security issue. Part 3 deals with why the government moved from tacit tolerance of Ming romanticism to outright suppression, classifying 1644 historiography as a severe threat.
The official intervention was rapid and decisive. Account closures, official media articles, and the introduction of this never-before-heard term, 1644 historiography. The severity of the official diagnosis is crucial here. They are not calling this a simple scholarly error.
No, and they group it with extreme feminism, which is very telling.
It highlights a common strategy, framing historical revisionism and identity politics that challenge official narratives as generalized threats to stability and state control. The official diagnosis is that the 1644 historiography narrative is deliberately distorting history and, critically, providing an excuse for those trying to negate the historical legitimacy of China's unified multi-ethnic state.
So they view this historical revisionism not as poor scholarship, but as aiding external forces that are aimed at deconstructing China's historical continuity. For the authorities, the integrity of the official history is paramount, because it serves a direct geopolitical function.
And that geopolitical function is maintaining the modern territorial boundaries. This is the heart of the matter. The modern PRC's vast territorial integrity, including Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia, is almost entirely inherited from the Qing Empire. It was the Qing that integrated China proper with the non-Han borderlands into one durable political entity.
So the legitimacy of ruling those non-Han borderlands today relies fundamentally on the historical continuity of the Qing dynasty being accepted as an inseparable, essential Chinese dynasty.
Precisely. The official state narrative relies on historical rights to legitimize its rule. If the Qing is viewed as merely a transient, ethnically distinct historical period of China, then modern China is entitled to inherit that entire territory. If, however, the Qing is framed as a distinct colonial empire, that justification begins to crumble.
And this is where Western scholarship, the New Qing history, or NQH, enters the political frame as a direct threat.
Absolutely. The official establishment views NQH as directly threatening the historical justification for current territorial claims. NQH scholars use multilingual sources, Manchu, Tibetan, Mongolian documents, to argue that the Qing was a multinational, multi-centric colonial empire governed by a Manchu elite with non-Chinese characteristics.
Can you give us an example of how NQH challenges that continuity narrative?
Well, they point out that Manchu rulers use different titles in different regions. They might be the Son of Heaven in China proper, but the Kagan or Great Khan in Mongolia, or the Emperor Manjushri in Tibet. These titles reflect the distinct political traditions of those ethnic groups, indicating the Qing was operating as a vast, multi-tiered empire, not simply as a Sinicized dynasty.
So framing the Qing as multinational rather than just Han-influenced challenges the very continuity the state requires. It suggests China proper was just one part of a larger imperial polity.
That's the ideological danger. Official historians have denounced NQH as a neo-imperialist project that suggests separatism is legal. The political control required over this narrative is so intense that, according to the sources, the government allegedly vetoed a draft of the authoritative official Qing history compiled by a government-appointed team because it was deemed overly influenced by NQH. They are spending massive state resources to ensure history confirms the current political borders.
That's the external pressure. But this anti-Qing restore Ming movement is an internal threat, an expression of Han nationalism, which must pose an even deeper political dilemma for the state's ideology of unity.
It is the ultimate tightrope walk, and it gets to the core official ideology, the Zhonghua Minzu doctrine, or the Chinese nation. This ideology emphasizes the Chinese nation as a diverse, cohesive, multi-ethnic community. It deliberately downplays ethnic conflict and demands political conformity from all groups. It's the big family of 56 nationalities concept.
But the Restore Ming slogan explicitly elevates Han identity above that multi-ethnic mandate.
It does. If the Ming, the last Han-led dynasty, is restored as the true, authentic China, it risks repudiating the vast non-Han territories Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia that were consolidated and integrated precisely during the Qing era. This aggressive Han nationalism, or Huang'an, often seen in calls to end affirmative action or attacks on Manchu-associated figures, directly contradicts the party's aim to strengthen the consciousness of the Chinese national community.
So the state has to simultaneously defend the Qing's territorial legacy to keep Tibet and Xinjiang, while suppressing Han nationalism to avoid alienating its non-Han minorities.
They walk that tightrope constantly. For example, Beijing has explicitly ordered propaganda departments and media not to use the term Manchu-Qing, Manqing, because it emphasizes the ethnic division. The narrative shifts the Qing conquest from a story of two different ethnic groups fighting to an internal civil war within the continuous Chinese historical trajectory, making it an inseparable part of China's continuity.
Right.
They even carefully manage historical memory, like avoiding the designation of Yu Fei, a Han general who fought against the Jurchens, who were Manchu ancestors, as a national hero in textbooks to further dilute that Han versus non-Han conflict narrative.
Where does this imperative for mandatory unity and cultural affinity come from? Why such an intense focus on cultural cohesion even over political differences?
It's driven by the perceived failure of the Soviet Union's Leninist nationality policy. Beijing's authorities analyzed the Soviet collapse and concluded that the policy, which formally created distinct ethnic categories, autonomous republics, and documented ethnicity on ID cards, ultimately created artificial divisions among the population.
So those policies, which were intended to manage diversity, inadvertently created the seeds of separation.
That was the conclusion. The authorities believed that once Central Soviet power weakened, there was no foundational cultural affinity left to bind these different ethnic groups together. The Leninist model had emphasized political class struggle and economic planning, but it failed to create a unified cultural identity.
So the lesson they took from the Soviet collapse was that political and economic integration isn't enough. You need deep, enforced cultural identity to survive external shocks and internal dissent.
Precisely. Identity is now viewed not merely as a cultural issue, but as a critical issue of national security crucial to regime survival. The policies we see today, like the bilingual education that mandates Mandarin instruction in minority regions, or the Sinicization of religious sites, are direct applications of this national security mindset. They are imposing a uniform Chinese cultural identity to ensure internal cohesion and territorial control, thereby countering narratives like the 1644 historiography that threaten the legitimacy of the Qing legacy and, consequently, the modern borders.
It's an incredible chain of cause and effect. A nostalgic internet meme about an old emperor triggers an official response that's rooted in 21st century geopolitical competition, territorial claims over Tibet, and the memory of the Soviet collapse. A debate about the 17th century becomes the crucible for processing 21st century anxiety over technology, culture, and state survival.
We have covered a vast, multi-layered landscape today, but the synthesis is clear. The significance of this 1644 debate is far from purely historical. On the surface, it's a symptom of economic anxiety, projecting the current global bottleneck onto the past, and romanticizing a Ming-era technological utopia that never fully materialized.
And culturally, it acts as a results-oriented critique of modern governance and perceived Western decline. It's a yearning for a romanticized late Ming ideal of intellectual authenticity and governance efficiency, free from the cultural and intellectual suppression that the Qing is accused of.
And politically, the entire debate is a high-stakes battleground for defining the foundational legitimacy of the modern Chinese identity and its territorial claims. The state has to defend the Qing's historical continuity to justify its sovereignty over its vast, non-Han borderlands, treating 1644 historiography as a severe threat to national security.
And as we close, we have to return to that profound historical irony we uncovered in the economic analysis. The romanticized Ming ideal that today's nationalists are seeking to revive, that agrarian, egalitarian small government system, is the core institutional reason China fell behind in the first place.
That is the ultimate twist of history. The Ming loyalists romanticized the king's entrenched fiscal weakness and its agrarian egalitarian ideals, the exact cultural and legal paradigm that systemically shut down all three mechanisms of capital accumulation: private land concentration, state extraction, and large corporations. This system, which prioritized protecting smallholders from exploitation, was the primary systemic cause of China's industrial underdevelopment relative to the West and Japan.
Which means that the solution to the Great Divergence and the achievement of modern prosperity require the state to completely demolish and reverse those romanticized institutions. China's stunning, successful, rapid industrialization was achieved precisely by decisively rejecting the entire Ming-Qing paradigm of low taxation and dispersed wealth, and embracing the aggressive statist policies that created the powerful capital accumulation mechanisms we see today.